We're told over and over that the cradle of humanity is Africa. A cradle? That place was hell. And here's the first piece of mental furniture I want to knock over. We were born there not because it was a good place to live, but precisely because it was horrific. A land where the ground split open, the forests evaporated, and the food vanished from one millennium to the next. In the middle of that chaos, there were creatures that learned to crack bones open with rocks and to tame fire. And here's the part that scrambles everything. The group that managed to escape that hell into a paradise is the one that went extinct, while the ones who stayed behind to suffer became us. To understand why, we first have to understand how a hell like that got built. Rewind several million years. From east to west, dense jungle blanketed the entire African continent. Our most distant ancestors gathered fruit high in the trees and sheltered under the leaves when the rain came. Threats existed, but food was everywhere. You only had to reach a hand out among the branches, and up there, if a leopard climbed after you, you could always escape from limb to limb. The jungle was both home and pantry, and for tens of millions of years that way of living worked flawlessly. And then, underground, something strange began to happen. From deep within the planet, the burning mantle started pushing up toward the surface. That immense heat lifted the continent's crust, and the African ground began, quite literally, to tear apart. Mountain ranges thrust up in the east, and at their feet a gigantic valley yawned open. That crack, the Great Rift Valley, runs from Mozambique in the south all the way to Ethiopia in the north. Picture a fracture long enough to more than cover a round trip from New York to Denver, splitting the ground in two. Sit with that for a moment, the ground under your feet pulling apart over millions of years. On a human timescale, it's imperceptibly slow, but the result was overwhelming. Colossal mountains like Kilimanjaro rose up, and enormous basins of water like Lake Victoria formed. The whole map of Africa was redrawn from top to bottom. But it didn't stop there. Those newborn mountains blocked the moist winds blowing in from the west. The Congo Basin kept getting drenched, while on the far side of the range to the east, the rain simply stopped. It's a phenomenon called a rain shadow. Once the water was cut off, the jungle began to die of thirst. The branches that had shaded the sky for millions of years dried out one by one, and in their place a low grass came up. Bit by bit, the lush jungle turned into savanna. For the primates living in the trees, it was like watching their world collapse, pillar by pillar, inside the only house they'd ever known. Some species retreated into the western jungle, and those are the ancestors of today's chimpanzees and bonobos. But the ones left in the east had nowhere to run. They could only watch as their homeland became a sea of grass. And here comes the truly cruel part. None of this happened in a single direction. The Earth doesn't circle the sun in a perfect ring. Its orbit wobbles on a cycle. The ellipse stretches a little, the tilt of the axis shifts slightly, and that wobble turned out to be lethal for East Africa. The reason is that this region's rain hinged on one single thing: the monsoon winds arriving from the Indian Ocean. Think of it this way: someone who draws a paycheck from 3 different companies can hang on even if one goes under. That was Europe and Asia, pulling moisture from the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Pacific. If one source faltered, the others held the system up. East Africa, by contrast, had a single paycheck, the Indian Ocean monsoon, and nothing else. It only took a slight shift in Earth's orbit for the Indian Ocean's atmospheric flow to stagger and the rains of East Africa to flip completely over. While Europe felt a mild rise and fall in temperature and Asia watched its glaciers creep forward and back a little, East Africa was overturned at the roots. Jungle became savanna, savanna became desert, and then the scrub returned. Imagine your city's climate being a tropical rainforest this year, and 100,000 years later, the Sahara. And that seesaw repeated dozens, hundreds of times. This isn't a guess. When you drill into the floor of East Africa's ancient lakes and analyze the sediment, that violent swing is recorded with chilling clarity. In one layer, traces of abundant aquatic life. In the layer right above it, nothing but bone-dry dust. Lakes filling to the brim and then drying out completely, over and over. Bodies of water tens of meters deep evaporating whole. For the animals living there, each of those episodes must have felt like the end of the world. In a place like that, being great at climbing trees wasn't enough, and being great at grazing grass wasn't either. It was a land where mastering any single thing was never going to keep you alive. And in that infernal country, someone showed up who could take it. Around 2.8 million years ago, in what is now Ethiopia, the jungle had all but vanished. Between the few scattered acacia trees stretched an endless grassland, and across that wind-rippled grass a small band of primates was walking on 2 legs, standing barely 4'3". Their earlier generations had lived plucking fruit in the trees, but the trees were gone now, so they had no choice but to come down to the ground. Standing upright wasn't a choice, it was the only option left. And they were hungry. There was no fruit, and roots couldn't fill a stomach. Then a carcass catches their eye. An antelope the hyenas have left half-finished. The meat is already stripped away, but the bones remain, and inside the bones is marrow, fatty, dense with calories, a treasure that yields 5 times the energy of the same weight in roots. The problem is that teeth can't break a bone. They had no hyena's jaw to crush them. One of them noses around, grabs a fist-sized rock, and brings it down on the bone. Once, twice, a third time. White, oily marrow starts seeping through the crack, and the whole band rushes in. That single moment may have been the first great invention in human history. Soon after, they took it a step further. They didn't just use the rock as it was, they struck one stone against another to knock out a cutting edge. Chimpanzees handle rocks too, to crack nuts, but working a stone to make a tool for making other tools was something no creature had ever done on the face of the earth. We call it the Oldowan industry. To the eye, they look like plain chipped flakes, but they carry a revolutionary idea, preparing for tomorrow. Not answering the hunger of this exact instant, but readying in advance the tool you'll use later. Right there was the boundary between animal and human. And there's something remarkable here. At one site in Kenya, these stone tools kept turning up across hundreds of thousands of years, in the same place over a stretch of time comparable to the whole history of our species. In that span, the environment shifted from a plain rich with water to a barren, desolate dry land. An ordinary animal facing a change that brutal would have migrated or gone extinct. They stayed. When there was forest, they ate fruit. When the savanna arrived, they scavenged carcasses and pulled out marrow. On the coast, they gathered to collect shellfish. Every time the world changed, they changed too, top to bottom, in what they ate and how they lived. Dig down through the layers of the site and you find that in the same spot, the animal bones differ from one level to the next. In one layer, hippo bones from a watery world, in another, the antelope bones of a dry savanna. It's proof that with every turn of the climate, they even switched which animals they hunted. And that is extraordinary. Look at the rest of the animal kingdom. The koala eats only eucalyptus leaves and the panda only bamboo. So when that food disappears, it's over. Those early humans, by contrast, were like a Swiss Army knife, with a different tool for every need. That flexibility was the real beginning of humanity. They had competitors in that same era. A species called Paranthropus had a massive jaw and powerful teeth, a specialist built for grinding roots, with molars big enough to crack a walnut shell and all. But when the savanna became desert and the roots disappeared, it went extinct. Australopithecus, specialized for climbing, with its long arms and curved fingers made for gripping branches, met the same fate the moment the trees were gone. Here's the telling detail. When you analyze the tooth enamel of those Paranthropus, you find it riddled with marks of enormous stress. As food ran short, they had to chew harder and longer. The tragedy of the specialist is that, faced with a problem, the only thing it knows to do is throw itself harder at the one thing it's good at. Master a single skill and you collapse when the world changes. The ones who survived were the generalists. But among those generalists, one group managed to escape the hell. About 1.8 million years ago, a new species appears, Homo erectus, clearly different from what came before. It stood close to 5'7", with long legs that let it walk for hours, and a considerably larger brain. In body, it wasn't so far from a modern person, and it became the first in Africa's history to leave the continent. Why did it go? The exact reason, nobody knows. What's certain is that it had a body engineered for travel, long legs that could cover tens of miles a day, and a highly efficient cooling system, with sweat glands spread across the whole body that let it keep moving for hours under the midday sun. At Dmanisi, in Georgia, at the foot of the Caucasus, fossils turned up dating to 1.85 million years ago, the oldest human trace found outside Africa. And the striking thing is that the 5 individuals from Dmanisi were quite different from one another in size and appearance. Some with smaller, more archaic brains, others somewhat more modern. That such varied forms lived side by side within a single group means they'd already left Africa carrying the seeds of that variety inside them. They didn't stop there. They pressed further east toward warmer country until they reached the island of Java in Indonesia, where tropical rainforests stretched on without end. Warm all year, generously rained on, overflowing with fruit and animals, it was the exact opposite of the African hell. Reach out to a tree and there was fruit. Step to the river and there were fish. There was no reason to go hungry. And because the temperature held steady, there was no need to brace for cold or take shelter from brutal heat. It was as good as paradise. Homo erectus lived in that paradise for 1.4 million years. Impressive, right? And yet, compare the earliest fossils with the latest and they're nearly identical. The brain didn't grow, the tools didn't advance, the behavior didn't change. In 1.4 million years, you could run the whole stretch from cave paintings to pyramids to walking on the moon dozens of times over, and across that immense span, nothing changed at all. Would anyone study at a school with no exams? Because the environment was stable, there was no reason to transform. Food was always there, threats were small, life was comfortable, so they stopped. In the end, Homo erectus went extinct, its last trace fading around 110,000 years ago, 1.4 million years in paradise without a single step forward. It's worth underlining one thing. It wasn't only Homo erectus that went to Asia. Later, the Neanderthals settled Europe and the Denisovans took Siberia and Southeast Asia. But every one of them eventually vanished too. The extreme environmental pressure, the only kind capable of forging a brand new species, existed only in Africa. And while those relatives were getting comfortable in their refuges, something completely different was unfolding back in Africa. The environment kept capsizing without rest. Forests disappeared and reappeared, savanna became desert and then flooded with water. Each time, the humans who remained in Africa were forced to invent a new method. If the water dried up here, they had to go find it there. If this prey vanished, they had to chase another. There was no choice but to keep working the brain non-stop. And that is why the brain grew. While the brain of Java's Homo erectus stayed all but frozen for 1.4 million years, the humans of Africa nearly doubled their cranial capacity, as if a brain the size of an orange had swelled to the size of a melon. Descendants of the same root, and still the difference the environment carved was that vast. Here, though, hides a paradox. A bigger brain isn't only a blessing, it's an organ that devours a brutal amount of energy. To keep a big brain running, you need enormous fuel, and on raw food alone, there was no way to cover the bill. The humans left in Africa needed one more decisive weapon. We find it in Wonderwork Cave, in South Africa, where in strata dating to around 1 million years ago, wood ash and charred bone fragments turned up. And not near the entrance, but deep in the back of the cave, a position a natural fire can't explain. If lightning had set it, the remains should have ended up near the mouth, not inside. Someone carried fire in, lit it, and kept it alive. But at this point, they weren't cooking yet. In the beginning, fire served other purposes. Picture the night. The eyes of hyenas and leopards gleaming in the dark at the mouth of the cave, dozens of pupils glittering in the shadows. Plant a single flame in front of them and those eyes begin to back away. They also used it to smoke dry caught meat and store it longer, because in an age without refrigerators, smoke was the only means of preservation. Think about what it meant to bring down an elephant, an animal weighing as much as 4 cars combined. Meat that rots in a day or two could hold for a whole month once smoked. Fire was both weapon and refrigerator. By day, they went out to find food, and at sundown, they returned to the cave and gathered around the flames. That habit of gathering around fire, scholars suspect, was the seed from which language and social life would later sprout. Cooking proper came a good deal later. There's evidence it was being done from at least around 270,000 years ago, and curiously, part of the trail comes from our genes. In experiments with mice fed raw food versus others given cooked food, the livers of the cooked food group showed a different pattern of gene expression. The genes tied to digestion and energy metabolism shifted markedly. When researchers traced those same genes in the human genome, they found signs that they spread quickly because they were advantageous for survival, and some evidence points to that happening before our lineage and the Neanderthals split apart, which would be a way of saying our bodies had been adapting to cooked food for an enormously long time. And why was cooking so decisive? Think of a chimpanzee which spends about 6 hours a day chewing and still barely covers a single day's energy. Raw food is hard to digest and poorly absorbed. It's a system that only works if the jaw and stomach labor without pause. With fire, the whole story changes. Cell walls rupture, proteins unfold, and digestion becomes vastly easier. So from the same food, the body pulls far more energy. With that engine running, Homo sapiens finally appears. Between 350,000 and 300,000 years ago, a skull was found in a cave in Morocco, and along a riverbank in Ethiopia, fossils from around the same era were recovered. From southern Africa to the east of the continent, Homo sapiens didn't emerge all at once in a single spot. There was no day on which, somewhere in Africa, a finished human being suddenly popped into existence. Every time the climate changed, Africa's populations were cut off from one another. When desert spread, the strip of savanna trapped in the middle became a kind of island you couldn't leave, And when the climate turned humid again, the desert pulled back, the savanna reconnected, the roads reopened, and the groups that had scattered met once more. That repetition of isolation and reunion, separating, mixing, separating again, mixing again, was the key. During the stretches of isolation, each group evolved its own way, fitting itself to its particular environment. Some grew more resistant to heat, some adapted to the thin air of high country, some lived off shellfish and fish on the coast. And when they finally crossed paths again, their genes combined and diversity exploded, like several cooks with different recipes coming together to invent a new dish. That process pushed genetic variety to its maximum, and that fingerprint is still here. The genetic diversity of the peoples living in Africa is greater than that of the entire population of the rest of the planet combined. Put another way, the genetic gap between a Kenyan and a Nigerian is wider than the one between a Korean and a Brazilian, simply because it's the place where human genes have mixed the longest and the most intensely. And here surfaces a discovery that stands the hair on end. When researchers analyzed the DNA of West African populations, they found the trace of an unknown ancient humanity for which not a single fossil has ever been recovered, present only in the genes. Scientists call it a ghost population, no bones, no sites, existing only in the DNA. Everyone's heard that the European genome carries a Neanderthal share. Well, within Africa, a far more complex and far older mixing took place. It's proof that there too our ancestors crossed with human species we haven't even named. Many separate rivers converging into one great river. That's Homo sapiens, not a single current, but the whole of Africa distilled into one being. Let's pull it together. Africa's land split apart and produced the most merciless environment on the planet. To survive that hell, its inhabitants broke stones and made tools. They lit fire to preserve meat and, later on, to cook it. Cooked food set off an energy revolution, and that energy blew the brain wide open. The constant seesaw of isolations and reunions generated an immense genetic diversity. No other continent held even one of these conditions. The Homo erectus that escaped Africa lived placidly in paradise until its evolutionary clock stopped. The comfortable side went extinct. The cruel side manufactured humanity. You've surely heard Darwin's phrase, survival of the fittest. A lot of people take it to mean the strongest survives, but its real sense is different. The one that best fits its environment survives. And in Africa's case, you have to take it one step further, because the environment never stopped changing. Fitting a particular setting well wasn't enough. What survived was whatever fit the change itself, whatever was strong against transformation. That was humanity. And between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, those graduates of hell finally left Africa. Beings that had passed a 3 million year exam fanned out across the whole world. Into the frozen zones of Europe, into the steppes of Asia, across the sea to Australia, all the way to the southern tip of the Americas. They crossed deserts, cleared glaciers, and sailed seas, carrying brains and tools that could adapt to any environment. The Homo erectus that had left 1.8 million years earlier could inhabit only a single type of environment. Homo sapiens was different, able to live in a Siberia at 50 below, in equatorial rainforest, and on the Tibetan plateau at 13,000 feet. 3 million years of withstanding every upheaval of the world had forged that total adaptability. We're in a similar situation today. The climate is transforming, technology is turning the world upside down, and no one knows what tomorrow holds. It's dizzying. But our ancestors held on for 3 million years inside that same uncertainty, finding a new way out every time the world caved in. Comfort changes no one. If we're human, it's largely because our ancestors never had a single comfortable moment. So if you're going through a rough stretch, hold on to this. Adversity was never the thing that destroyed us. It's the raw material we're made of. At this very moment over in East Africa, the rift keeps pulling open. They say that millions of years from now the continent will truly split in two, and no one knows what kind of creature will be born then in that wound in the earth. Tell me in the comments what you think. Do you really believe human beings need hardship to move forward, or could we have become what we are from comfort? And if you like looking at our origins from this angle, subscribe to the channel.